let me begin. There is a lot of discussion about localization at the moment. I think it's a term which is used quite randomly at times, and it's used from the global level of narratives right down to the local level. Donor organizations, international NGOs, they're calling to look at local government more, they're calling to look at the role of local NGOs more, civil society organizations more. Local leaders and local employers with control over the NGO, their financial resources, their programming, their planning, these are all increasingly being discussed and focused upon at the moment. And there's a lot of talk about popular participation, participatory democracy, and much more in this line of thinking is emerging. And I think it's generally important to recognize that global actors want the local players to play a larger role, to have increased responsibility for the decisions taken and much more. And this is true if you look at the World Bank, if you look at international organizations like ActionAid, UNDP, United Nations Capital Development Fund, Dutch Aid, etc. They are all moving in this area. But what do they actually mean? Well, decentralization itself has been discussed a lot. And if we probably still use the definition or the breakdown given by Dennis Rondinelli way back in 1981. And he talked about decentralization, deconcentration, and deregulation. And I think that's a good starting point when one's thinking about, well, what you're seeking to do and why you're seeking to do it. Decentralization is when roles and responsibilities are passed down. And in fact, Rondinelli, I think he gave a short but very concise definition. He said it's the transfer of authority and responsibility for public functions from central government to subordinate or quasi-independent government organizations, or even the private sector. And there you have the full range. You have decentralization, which is passing responsibilities and resources downwards. It's deconcentration, where you retain control at the center, but agencies at the local level. And it's deregulation, which is when you increasingly turn to the private sector. But in practice, it's not so simple. How does one avoid localization from becoming something we call glocalization? Let me explain what I mean by that. It's about creating an image of the local at the national level, and then designing a program to implement which fits that image or picture of the local you've created. So in fact, it's a global localization, and that can be a big problem. That can be a real challenge. A classic example would then be that agency is given to local actors, but it's based on a global model of what it is that is to be done and what the situation is. And that is when you effectively are getting a controlled situation. And in my eyes, and in terms of what West Bengal has been trying to achieve and what we seek to achieve in many other locations where I've also worked, that is not about decentralization. It's not about transferring responsibilities and accountability to a lower level. It's also an issue when you have formal organizations playing the principal controlling role. Local councils, local NGOs, women's organizations. Because the danger there is that one is ignoring the point that informal organizations are critically important. For instance, the family network, informal political contacts, social networks, including not least party connection, links to institutions based on identity politics, to name a few. So it's complicated. There are many questions here. What model of civil society are we operating with here? Civil society being between the citizen and the state. and mediating, particularly for those citizens who perhaps are not securing adequate representation in the decision-making arenas of the state. They could be women, it could be an ethnic minority, it could be a locality which is ignored or forgotten. Their civil society can play a very critical role, or for particular groups with particular interests. And here civil society can be a football club, it can be a library, it can be any form of associational activity which helps link the citizen in some way to the state, the resources that the state has, generated from citizens, of course, and their allocation back to pursue certain projects, programs, infrastructural development, whatever. Are NGOs a part of civil society? Some suggest that they are better understood as being part of the private sector. It has a lot to do with their objectives and their engagement with citizens on the one hand, and the government on the other. Not least, who are they accountable to? Another question would be, how willing is one to give a civil society organization freedom to follow its own path? Can it make decisions outside the framework that others are asking it to operate within? And what about local intellectuals that mobilize with a view of the past? This we see in many situations in India, West Bengal, Nepal, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Bhutan. We have seen where intellectuals seek to mobilize with very good and well-meaning interests, but using a means of association linked to the past that is then projected into the future. And identity politics is a very good example of that. Are political parties agents for positive development? And this is a critical question when choosing how or whether to work or relate with them. So, what should organization working at the local level, how should they approach these issues? Well, certainly all local actors, and here I would use the term citizens, should be brought into governance. And I use the term governance, so it's not just formal government institutions, it's also informal, possibly traditional institutions. They also have to be recognized and be seen to have a key role to play. This can be through participation, that's actually physically attending meetings, or it can be through what we call substantive representation. There's a lot of discussion about representation, but let me just make a simple distinction between symbolic representation and substantive representation. Symbolic would be when you have a woman elected because you're a woman. You have a particular, maybe a Brahmin elected because you're a Brahmin. You have a Dane elected because you're a Dane. This is symbolic representation. Substantive is when it's based around a strong engagement between the representative and those represented, about engaging to understand each other's positions vis-a-vis the issues being discussed, whether or not that is to do with rural development, access to economic resources, immigration, etc. It should be that both formal and informal arenas are part of the framework which one's working with. But how to do this and to what purpose? Here I'll introduce or talk about two fairly simple analytical frameworks which can help here. Firstly, I would make the distinction between what we talk about, the role of agency and the role of structure. Mohan and his family, should he migrate to Delhi, or maybe should he move overseas? In the latter case, should he move legally or illegally? Should he secure a visa or try to slip over the international border? What are others saying? What are his friends saying on social media? What do NGOs talk about here? What do bureaucrats talk about here? What about the family, the priest? They all play a role in actually shaping the decision that he and his family will make, their agency. So already here we're seeing agency is not just individual freedom, it's about an environment, or what I would call a space, in which that decision is taken. And who else is shaping that space? Well, normally as an academic we would then talk about structures, and that's the role of, for instance, gender or caste or ethnicity or economic situation, access to property, wealth, etc. Because these are structural factors which very much shape what decision Mohan eventually makes. But there are two other areas, and these are critical, I think, for when working at the local level. One is discourses or narratives. And here I would point out that Mohan's friends who've migrated overseas, they've borrowed money to go overseas. And they're writing on social media about how great it is where they are, how much money they're earning, how it's a different life. There is no discrimination on the basis of those forms of discrimination he experienced back home. He's sending money back to his family, and they're able to build a house, and his brothers and sisters are going to school. But these discourses are also NGO discourses. Governments, particularly their donors, these discourses, they're all shaping how that space I referred to before is being seen and being viewed. And the other dimension I would include are institutions. And institutions, as I've mentioned already, that can be the formal and the informal. What does your priest say? What does your elder say? What does your father say? These are all institutions which are again shaping that space. So when it comes to the practice, what actually happens? Does Mohan go? Does he not go? These other dimensions need to be understood, and that's where the role of civil society organizations, the role of NGOs, the role of local government institutions, the role of other informal institutions are critical, and areas which one can work with to try and, hopefully, create a situation with a better opportunity for, shall we say, improving livelihood, for changing one's own situation, one's family situation, and one's community or village situation. The other analytical tool which I suggest is very useful, and that is to talk about the difference between transactional change and transformative change. Transactional change is simply about producing absolute change. So that means more food on the table, more money in the salary, more land to be cultivated. It's simply a quantitative change in situation. But transformative change, this is when you change the relationships which give rise to the amount of money in the salary, the amount of land which can be accessed, the ability to get credit from a bank, the ability for women to speak in a public meeting and not to sit on the outside. These types of changes. You're changing social relations, you're changing political relations, and probably importantly, you're changing economic relations. It may be that absolute change is the easiest. You simply provide funds so that children could go to school, provide meals so that children eat better and go to school, provide clinics in rural areas so that mothers can give birth in a clinic and not at home. These are obviously important and important changes, but when one looks at the sustainability and the ability to maybe lead to other forms of change, that's when the relational side comes in. It's important to work with both, but the tendency is to only work with the first. The last point I would make is going back to my comment on substantive representative democracy. In West Bengal, there has been a significant shift, because this is what I personally have seen emerging towards more substantive representative democracy. When I first came to West Bengal, the panchayats, it was before Panchayat Raj was introduced, they were simply symbolic. They were not political parties, but you knew which political party the Pradhan represented. There was very little expectation and there was very little role, in fact, apart from reinforcing local hierarchies within the village. But from the implementation of Panchayat Raj, for me, that demonstrated how policy can have a substantive change on people's livelihoods. And it was very interesting. One example, when I first came, there was a lot of talk about the Green Revolution in India. Where was the success? Haryana, Punjab. It was not West Bengal. Why was West Bengal not seen as a potential for Green Revolution? Small land holdings, a lot of sharecropping, bagchash. It was not seen as a potential. But Panchayat Raj, and actually with that, giving greater security, not least to Bagadas, to sharecroppers, enabled people to invest in their future. And you began to see an economic growth in West Bengal, totally unexpected, but at some stages in the 80s was the fastest in India. And that just demonstrated how reforms which were in the political arena, perhaps, Panchayat Raj, can impact substantively on economic change and people's livelihoods. Elected local governments in symbolic representation, elected local governments and representatives are accountable to their citizens. And I use the word citizen deliberately because I am a citizen of Denmark. I have rights and responsibilities with respect to the state and the government of Denmark. But I also have rights and responsibilities to my fellow citizens. So it goes both citizen-citizen as well as citizen-state. It's important that representatives, those I vote for, that they are accountable to the citizens. But remember, it's not just the citizens who voted for them, it's all the citizens in their electoral area, because that's who they represent. Civil society organizations seek to represent particular marginalized groups and citizens with specific challenges. And here I can give a very good example from Raniban Forest Range, where I worked for some time looking at women's cooperatives which were producing tussa silk cocoons in arjun trees. When the arjun trees were first planted and they gained access to land from the forest department, which did not have forest on, men just said, oh, this is nothing. They let the cows eat the leaves on the arjun trees. The women said, but this is so important because we don't have to migrate down to Midnapore and Burdwan and parts of Bankra 4 times a year to harvest and transplant, harvest and transplant. We don't have to go with our children, and they are missing out on their education then. And when we come back, we find our husband has gone with another woman. Now we only migrate perhaps twice a year at the most, because we have the arjun trees, we are cultivating tussa silk, we are selling them. The men changed when they saw the income coming. So that changed the household, the family institution. So as well as improving the lives of the women and their children, it also strengthened the family. I spoke to 2 state assembly members from that area, and I said, when they were developing these cooperatives, when I was there, I think there were 22 cooperatives, why were you a little bit silent? And they said, very honestly, they said, well, it's because we support them. And we want that change. But if we were too open, men would not vote for me. The people down in Midnapore and Birbhum and Bardwan, they would not vote for our party because they would see us as stopping the women coming. So it was difficult. So in that situation, it was very important that you had an NGO which was helping the women organize, which was helping them negotiate with the purchases of the tussa silk, and helping the women in their relationship with the forest department in Raniband Forest, because at that stage they did not have representation despite the introduction of local democracy, you could say. And it just brought home to me how important the role of civil society organizations, and in this case the NGO, can be. So Danish NGOs, and I speak someone coming from Denmark, I would argue try and hopefully play the role of being partners and not being controllers. And here, for instance, I would mention a mechanism which I have worked with in several other countries with local development and local government, is what we call minimum conditions and performance monitoring. Now, just to be very brief, one identifies something like 8 or 10 basic activities that one's local government should be undertaking. And this could be participatory planning process, presentation of the final plan, and financial audit that is independently undertaken. They are just examples. You then monitor the performance once a year on these indicators. They're short, they're simple, they're not complex, but they enable citizens to actually assess the work of their own local government. Maybe also a local NGO, you can apply the same approach. The conditions can be collectively agreed upon. And interestingly enough, the initial reaction of bureaucrats and also politicians can be, this is dangerous, this is undermining my position. But in the longer term, if improved development is the result, and if social media is picking up on this and taking local stories to be national stories, then suddenly politicians begin to say, this is good. This is recognizing that we have achieved something. And local bureaucrats are also able to say, this is good. It demonstrates that I have been successful in the work that I have been appointed to undertake. The final point I would make is that when working with the local, one should not say that this is going away from the center, because a strong local makes a strong center. I would argue that some of the strongest governments that one can see around the world are those where they have strong local government. They have a high level of participation. They have effective substantive or representation. And it creates a reciprocal relationship between the local and the center that is mutual beneficial to both. And I think that's very important, because in the initial stages, many at the central level will feel that they're losing power, they're losing responsibility, they're losing control over resources. But in the longer term, when the benefits begin to emerge, and there are many what we call multiplier effects that come from these benefits, then the narrative begins to change. And that takes me right back to the importance of trying to shape that narrative, and that is for, again, for CSOs and NGOs to play a key role. So, thank you.